No one really understood what was about to happen in that makeshift ring. In just a few seconds, a simple disagreement would turn into something so unexpected that it would bring the entire crowd to a halt, every breath suspended in the air. It was a hot afternoon, and the whole village had gathered to watch the young champions train. The three most famous fighters in the area, known for their strength, speed, and overly confident attitudes, stood at the center of the ring, showing off moves and techniques impressive enough to silence any visitor. Their defined bodies, loud laughter, and the way they dominated the space made it clear who ruled that place. But everything shifted when an elderly man, around 80 years old, walked across the training area at his own calm pace. He wasn't there to challenge anyone, nor did he look interested in showing off. He was simply an old man passing through, observing the commotion with the serenity of someone who had already seen far more than those young men could imagine. Yet, to the three fighters, his fragile appearance was nothing more than a joke. Their leader, the same one pointing in the picture, let out a loud laugh, drawing attention from everyone around. The moment he stretched his arm and pointed at the old man, part of the crowd began laughing too. It looked like any other scene, arrogant youth, spectators waiting for entertainment. But something in the old man's expression stood out. He didn't smile, didn't step back, didn't look bothered. He simply kept walking as if nothing was happening. "Hey, Grandpa," the leader called out, still laughing. "This is a training area. Don't trip and hurt yourself." His friends burst out laughing. The sound echoed off the old buildings around them. Many young fighters in the back rows, all wearing their light blue uniforms, watched closely. Some frowned, others shifted uncomfortably. There was something off about that moment, and it wasn't just the mockery. The old man stopped, lifted his eyes, and in the silence that followed, everyone felt the atmosphere shift. The leader of the fighter gang stepped forward again, confident, almost theatrical, believing this would be just another moment to show off his strength in front of the crowd. But the old man stayed still, rooted to the ground. There was something undeniable in his posture, centered, steady, grounded. He didn't look fragile at all. He looked like someone carrying a history much bigger than that arena could ever hold. The provocateur moved closer and tried to push the old man with a single finger, and that's when everything happened. With a movement so fast that only a few actually caught it, the old man turned his body slightly, almost as if he were redirecting the air around him, and placed his hand on the young man's chest with absolute precision. It wasn't a violent strike, nor a reaction of anger. It was technical, surgical, silent. The impact didn't look forceful, but the result stunned everyone. The fighter, who had been laughing just seconds earlier, lost his balance abruptly and dropped to his knees as if the weight of his own body had suddenly crushed him. The laughter vanished instantly. The other two fighters stepped back, shocked, trying to understand what they had just witnessed. The crowd froze in absolute silence. The old man simply took a deep breath and held his stance. He didn't raise his fists, didn't brag, didn't show an ounce of aggression. His calm was almost intimidating, and in that single moment, that single flawless movement, everyone realized they had witnessed something extraordinary. It wasn't magic, and it wasn't luck. It was technique, it was experience. It was mastery, pure, refined mastery that few there had ever seen. While the young fighter on the ground struggled to breathe, the old man stepped forward, looked at the remaining two, and spoke in a calm, deep voice that echoed through the entire arena. "Respect always comes before strength." The phrase hit everyone like an invisible blow, a powerful reminder that humility is never weakness. And from that moment on, no one dared laugh again. The silence that had taken over the arena didn't fade right away. It lingered there, hanging in the air like a heavy mist, while everyone struggled to make sense of what they had just seen. The fighter on his knees was still trying to catch his breath, shaken far more by the humiliation than by any physical pain. The old man, meanwhile, kept the same serene expression as before, as if that precise strike had been nothing more than a routine gesture, something as ordinary to him as breathing. In the back rows, the trained young fighters began exchanging uneasy glances. These men weren't beginners. Many had spent years mastering combat techniques, studying movement, building strength, refining control. They knew when they were witnessing something unusual, and this wasn't just skill, this was mastery. The two fighters who had accompanied their leader took a few steps back, not out of fear, but pure disbelief. They had seen the touch. They had seen the lightness of it. They had seen the sudden collapse, but what they couldn't wrap their minds around was how any of it had been possible. A simple touch doesn't bring down a trained man. A simple touch doesn't drop a champion to his knees. A simple touch doesn't silence an entire crowd, unless it comes from someone who commands their own body on a level few can comprehend. The crowd, still frozen, began leaning forward. It was as if everyone wanted to breathe in sync with the old man, searching for some clue, some hidden secret in his posture. He stood firmly, spine straight, hands relaxed, feet aligned as though anchored to the ground by invisible roots. Every detail of his presence seemed to tell an ancient, silent, powerful story. The leader tried to get up, bracing a hand against the floor, but his arms trembled. He wasn't injured, he was in shock. His pride had been struck in a way no amount of hard training had ever managed to do. The crowd saw it, the whole village saw it, and that changed everything. Among the spectators, murmurs began to spread. Some people whispered about rare techniques, others mentioned secret training styles, and a few even wondered aloud whether the old man might be some retired master. Nothing was confirmed, nothing proven, but one thing was certain. No one saw him as just a fragile old man anymore. One of the instructors from the local academy, a seasoned, highly respected veteran, stepped forward, trying to get a better look. His eyes narrowed as he examined the elder's posture, and his face shifted into an expression almost no one had ever seen on him before, genuine admiration. It was rare for someone of his rank to show that kind of respect, but in that moment he knew he was looking at someone extraordinary. The old man drew in a deep breath, and the soft afternoon breeze quietly lifted the sleeve of his simple clothing. There was something in that tiny movement that spoke of discipline. Not trained discipline, but lived discipline. The kind that only appears after decades of practice, study, and deep understanding of oneself. The two fighters who were still standing tried to regain their composure. It was obvious they didn't know whether to react, stay still, or step away. They exchanged a quick glance, and that hesitation revealed something that had never been part of their behavior: doubt. The old man finally took a step toward the fallen fighter, not to intimidate him or rub salt in the wound, but simply to look him directly in the eyes. There was a lesson there, unspoken. It wasn't about winning, it wasn't about power, it wasn't about showing dominance. It was about balance, about control, about responsibility. His voice broke the silence for the first time since the strike, not harsh, not angry, but steady, firm, weighted with meaning. The strength that lacks respect destroys itself. The fighter lifted his head, and for the first time since this all began, his eyes weren't filled with arrogance or superiority. They held something else: internal conflict, realization, shame. In that instant, he understood he had crossed a line. He had mistaken force for authority, power for pride. And that mistake had a cost. The two companions behind him swallowed hard. The old man's words cut through the arena like a silent bolt of lightning. Instantly, several spectators lowered their heads, as if they too had felt the lesson strike deep within. The atmosphere was no longer one of mockery. It was respect, a level of respect no one there imagined could rise so suddenly. And as the sun dipped lower on the horizon, casting a soft, almost symbolic light around the old man's figure, The entire village realized that the day wouldn't be remembered because a champion had fallen, but because they had all witnessed how a single, perfectly executed strike can teach more than years of training. Strength impresses, but wisdom transforms. The leader finally managed to get back on his feet, his pride still bruised, though he tried to keep a mask of strength in front of the crowd. The silence around him weighed heavier than any physical blow he had ever taken. It was impossible to ignore what had just happened. In front of the entire village, one single movement had brought him to his knees, something even seasoned opponents had never been able to do. But the worst part wasn't the fall. The worst part was the feeling that for the first time, people were truly seeing him, not as a skilled fighter, but as someone who didn't control his temper or his ego. His two companions, tense and unsettled, stepped forward, as if trying to regain control of the situation. They eyed the old man from head to toe, searching for any sign of weakness, any justification for a reaction or a rematch. But the longer they looked, the clearer it became that there was no opening. The old man stood steady before them, utterly calm, breathing slowly, feet planted firmly in the dirt, his presence seeming to grow as everyone began to grasp what they had just witnessed. One of the fighters, the most impulsive of the trio, clenched his fists. He couldn't accept the idea that their leader had been taken down so easily. It felt as though their honor was being challenged, as if the reputation they had built over years could crumble because of a single strike. His wounded pride flared like a fire, fed by the crowd's silence. Then he stepped forward. The movement was so sudden that several people along the sides of the arena jumped back. A ripple of murmurs spread among the spectators. They knew this could go wrong. They knew that young man had a volatile temper and enough strength to cause real trouble. But they also knew the old man didn't seem like someone ordinary. The impulsive fighter advanced, positioning his body in a stance everyone recognized. This wasn't posturing. This was a real fighting stance. He drew in a deep breath, tightened his muscles, and leaned forward, prepared to unleash a fast, powerful strike meant to intimidate or even knock down anyone unprepared. But the old man didn't move. His stillness only angered the young fighter more. It was as if the elder was silently telling him that his aggression meant nothing, that all that raw strength without direction was empty. The tension spiked. The young man growled, driven by frustration, and launched his attack with a burst of speed so sharp that some spectators covered their mouths. In that instant, the entire arena seemed to hold its breath, but something happened before the strike could reach its target. The old man shifted his weight in a nearly invisible adjustment, a movement so subtle that anyone unfamiliar with advanced technique might mistake it for a simple change of footing. But to those who understood balance, timing, and body reading, it was the first step of a precise technique, the perfect anticipation. When the attack came, the old man didn't retreat. He rotated his hips, slid one foot, and placed two fingertips exactly at the point where the young man's arm generated momentum. That tiny touch stopped the strike cold, unraveling all the force behind it. And before anyone could fully process what had just happened, the young fighter lost his balance on his own. There was no impact, no violence, no resistance. He simply lost his center and fell, first sideways, then onto his knees, with a confused look that made it clear he still didn't understand what had brought him down. The crowd erupted into frantic whispers. It wasn't magic. It wasn't supernatural strength. It was technique, pure technique. The leader, still emotionally shaken from the first encounter, felt something he wasn't used to feeling. Fear. Not physical fear, but fear of the truth. The old man wasn't weak. He wasn't vulnerable. He wasn't someone they could intimidate. He was someone who understood combat on a level they hadn't even begun to touch. The elder looked at the fallen young man, then at the leader, and once again remained calm. There was no arrogance, no triumph, no mockery. Just the serenity of someone who understands that fighting isn't about defeating. It's about teaching. The entire village watched without daring to blink as the soft wind rustled the banners above the arena. The air felt charged with a new kind of energy. This was no longer a training session. This wasn't a demonstration. This was a confrontation between maturity and impulse, experience and pride, wisdom and brute force. And none of it was going in the young fighter's favor. The tension morphed into something larger, something no one had expected to witness that day. As the dust in the arena still drifted slowly around the young man who had just fallen, something shifted in the crowd's behavior. It wasn't just surprise, and it wasn't only respect. It was a shared sense of realization, as if everyone were suddenly aware that the presence of that old man carried a meaning far greater than a simple display of skill. The trio's leader stared at his companion on the ground, and for the first time he seemed quieter than the wind itself. The strike that had brought him down earlier had already wounded his pride, but watching another member of his group be dismantled with the same ease, if not even more effortlessly, made cracks appear in his confidence. His breathing grew heavier, his eyes restless, his posture stiff, as though his body were trying to hide an inner confusion. Doubt wasn't something he was used to feeling, but now it was unavoidable. Meanwhile, along the edges of the arena, the spectators whispered among themselves. Some of the more experienced fighters began connecting dots, trying to remember if they had ever seen movements like those before. Others quietly retold old stories, legends about masters who trained far from traditional academies, men who devoted their lives to perfecting techniques that were invisible to anyone focused on brute strength. Everyone there seemed to be finding their own meaning in what they had witnessed. The 3 instructors from the local academy were also present, seated together in the back row. They were known for being strict, disciplined, and highly skeptical of anything outside traditional methods. But now, none of them could hide their shock. One instructor leaned forward, studying every detail of the old man, the positioning of his feet, the alignment of his hips, the way his hand rested calmly at his side. He wasn't searching for weakness. He was searching for logic, and those subtle, devastating techniques held far too much logic to be ordinary. On the opposite side of the arena, a group of young students watched with eyes wide open. To them, this felt like watching a legend step out of a storybook. Many had grown up hearing tales told by their grandparents, stories of masters who won battles without having to injure anyone. Seeing something like that unfold right in front of them made the moment feel almost mythical. It was as if they were witnessing the rare appearance of a knowledge long lost to time. Among these young students, one boy seemed more affected than all the others. A thin kid with gentle features and an attentive gaze watched every gesture the old man made, as if committing each one to memory. He didn't blink, didn't look away. It was as though he understood something instinctively, as if the elder wasn't just showing a technique, but revealing a path. He didn't know the old man's name, but something inside him told him he needed to learn from him, even if he never found the courage to ask. At the same time, standing in the shadow of one of the old buildings surrounding the arena, 2 older men watched in absolute silence. They didn't belong to the village. Their more discreet clothing hinted that they were there for another reason, perhaps even before the event began. One crossed his arms and murmured something the other understood immediately. They seemed to recognize that kind of technical mastery. They seemed to know the old man wasn't ordinary. And while the crowd was enchanted, those 2 looked concerned. The contrast between all these unfolding subplots, admiration, fear, discovery, suspicion, made the atmosphere grow even heavier. This was no longer just the story of young fighters being surprised. It was the story of an entire village being confronted with something it didn't fully understand, something that stirred curiosity, respect, and a touch of apprehension. Every person carried a different interpretation of the moment, and together these interpretations formed an invisible web that wrapped around the arena. Meanwhile, the impulsive young fighter was still on his knees, trying to make sense of what had happened. He slowly lifted his head and met the old man's gaze. It wasn't a look of superiority. It was, once again, a look of instruction, and that might have been more powerful than any physical blow. The elder seemed to see straight through people, as if he could identify what moved them and what held them captive. That simple exchange of looks caused something inside the young man to break. He didn't stand immediately. He took a deep breath, placed a hand on his knee, and began to rise, not with his usual arrogance, but carefully, thoughtfully. It was a slow movement, almost symbolic, the beginning of a change he never expected to experience. And while the entire village watched every detail, something even bigger began to form at the center of that arena. Not a physical confrontation, but an internal one, a confrontation that would transform not only those three fighters, but everyone who stood there witnessing it. That old man had appeared as if he had no purpose at all. But without saying his name, without raising his voice, without showing any brute power, he was rearranging the structure of the entire village, revealing layers no one knew existed until now. The tension in the air felt almost tangible, as if every person in the arena were holding their breath at the exact same time. The trio's leader, still shaken, stared at the old man with an expression the crowd rarely saw on him: uncertainty. Until that moment, he had built his entire reputation on being untouchable, someone who controlled every situation, no matter the opponent. But now, for the first time in years, he wasn't in command. The old man's presence had turned everything upside down. His breathing grew heavier, his face slightly flushed with a mix of anger, shame, and disbelief. He knew everyone was watching him, not just his companions, but the entire village. This moment could define him for years to come, and he felt the weight of that truth pressing on his chest like a stone. Every step he took, every gesture he made felt heavier than the last, as if he were pushing through an invisible barrier. The two fighters beside him were just as lost. One was still struggling to recover from the precise strike that had dismantled him with nothing but a touch. The other was fighting to hide the growing fear of being taken down just as easily. It was strange for them to realize that no amount of physical strength had prepared them for this. Nothing had. The crowd watched in absolute silence, something almost unheard of in events this intense. Even the children, usually restless, were frozen in place, eyes glued to every detail, and it was in that silence that the leader finally gathered the nerve to take another step forward. He wasn't going to attack recklessly this time. There was something different in his eyes now. It wasn't just anger, it was resolve. He took a deep breath, straightened his posture, and locked his gaze onto the old man. The crowd leaned forward. The wind seemed to ease. The air grew dense. "Who are you?" the leader asked, his voice rough, almost cracking under the weight of frustration. The question echoed across the arena, bouncing off the old buildings and reaching even the most distant spectators. It was the first time that young man had ever admitted not knowing something. His first indirect confession that he was standing before someone far greater than he'd imagined. The old man lifted his chin slowly. There was no arrogance there, no challenge. Only that same growing calm, as if he were a stone standing firm in the middle of a storm. "Someone who learned that strength without purpose is just noise," the old man replied, his voice low but firm enough for everyone to hear. The words shot through the arena like an arrow. Every person there felt the impact. It wasn't just a lesson for the leader. It was a lesson for anyone ruled by impulse, by the need to prove something, by the hunger for dominance. Suddenly, the entire village saw itself reflected in that single sentence. The leader clenched his fists, but he didn't advance. For the first time, he seemed to truly be listening. And that alone was a turning point. He who had always been driven by pride was now being moved by something deeper. Something inside him began to give way, not out of fear, but understanding. Meanwhile, the two mysterious men, watching from the shadows, exchanged a serious look. They knew, more than anyone there, what the old man's posture meant. They recognized the level of skill, the discipline, the precise control. This wasn't ordinary talent. It wasn't luck. It was the result of a lifetime of training, shaped by experiences no one could replicate quickly. And that meant the old man's story was far bigger than anyone in the arena realized. The impulse that drove the leader then wasn't an attack, but something unexpected. He took a deep breath and stepped forward again, this time with enough humility to lower his head slightly. Not to the ground, not in submission, but in acknowledgement. The crowd held its breath. The instructors in the back widened their eyes. It was so unlikely, so uncharacteristic, that many couldn't believe what they were seeing. The old man kept his gaze steady, observing every movement. And when the leader lifted his head again, something in his expression had changed. Not completely, not like some miracle transformation, but enough for everyone to notice. This was the moment when the story stopped being about a fight and became about transformation. The turning point wasn't a strike, it was the fall of pride, and that impact echoed louder than any blow ever thrown in that arena. The change that had begun in the leader did not go unnoticed. The moment he lowered his head ever so slightly before the old man, a murmur swept through the arena like a sudden gust of wind. It was so rare to see him act with humility that many spectators exchanged looks, unable to believe what they were witnessing. It was like watching a mountain bow to a stream, unexpected, symbolic, and profoundly transformative. The young fighters from the local academy, long accustomed to following the trio who dominated the village, now watched with a different kind of attention. Some looked confused, others curious, and a few visibly moved. The moment carried a kind of invisible weight, as if the village itself were shifting, a quiet realignment of what strength and respect truly meant. The academy's oldest instructor stepped forward, getting close enough to study not the technique, but the behavior. His gaze traveled from the young fighters to the old man, then back to the trio. To him, a man who had spent a lifetime teaching discipline, watching a prideful student lower his guard wasn't a sign of weakness. It was a sign of growth. And when growth happens in front of an entire village, it becomes an example. The impulsive young fighter, who moments earlier had been dismantled by nothing more than a precise touch, struggled to get up. But something in his posture had changed too. His shoulders were no longer raised with arrogance. His breathing, once fast and furious, had settled. It was clear he was still trying to understand what had happened, but the anger that previously fueled him seemed to have lost its strength. He looked at the old man as someone who finally understands the difference between skill and wisdom. The older spectators murmured about how the scene reminded them of past stories of fighters who weren't driven by victory, but by balance. For many of them, seeing an elderly man effortlessly outclass such powerful youths rekindled memories from a time when technique was valued above ego. It was as if that old man had revived a lost tradition, one where fighting wasn't meant to harm, but to teach. The children watched with wide, glowing eyes. To them, the moment was nothing less than a living legend. And years from now, they would be the ones passing the story on, not about a strike or a fall, but about a lesson, about the strength of calm, about the importance of respect, about how true masters don't need to raise their voices to be heard. Meanwhile, quiet tension built between the two mysterious men standing in the shadows of the nearby buildings. The first crossed his arms, aware that this public display might draw far too much attention. The second watched the old man with a mix of admiration and caution. They knew the man wasn't ordinary. They knew that kind of technique wasn't learned in common academies. They knew a single touch capable of neutralizing two fighters wasn't luck. And the fact that he was performing these movements so naturally in front of an entire village was reason enough for them to remain silent and observe every detail. The trio's leader, still breathing deeply, finally lifted his eyes and took a few steps back, creating distance between himself and the old man, but not out of fear, out of respect. His companions followed his lead with a mix of caution and reverence. No one dared step forward again. There was no atmosphere left for confrontation. What stood before them had transcended physical strength. They knew that pressing on would be foolish, and foolishness in that moment would come at a high cost. The entire village felt something different in the air. It was as if every person present understood that they had just witnessed the beginning of something profound. Not just a change in the trio of young fighters, but a change in the very heart of the community. Until now, strength had been the measure of respect. Strength had been the social currency that determined who had a voice. But a single touch from an unknown elder had shattered that belief. From that moment on, everyone there knew that something was being rearranged. Titles, reputations, fears, vanities, all of it was realigning in the presence of that silent old man. It was as if a new hierarchy were being formed, not based on who could overpower more opponents, but on who could remain steady, calm, and centered in the midst of chaos. And so, without fanfare, without raising his voice, without even showing aggression, the old man had triggered the greatest upheaval the village had ever seen. His steady composure, the precision of his movements, the absence of pointless violence, all of it left a mark that rippled through the crowd like waves across a still lake. A mark no one would forget anytime soon. And as the late afternoon sun lowered in the sky, casting long shadows across the arena, the sense that something even greater was about to unfold grew stronger. This was no longer just a training session or a clash of youth. It was something that touched every person present, a sense that this unexpected encounter would lead to consequences far deeper than anyone imagined. The atmosphere in the arena had completely shifted. The old man didn't need to say another word. His presence spoke loudly enough. What had once been a simple physical confrontation had turned into a quiet process of personal reckoning. A moment in which every person there was forced to look inward, question long-held beliefs, and confront their own limitations. The trio's leader breathed deeply, trying to organize his thoughts. The sting of physical defeat had already faded, but the emotional impact still rang inside him like a freshly struck bell. It was strange to realize that for the first time there was no one he could blame. It wasn't a technical mistake. It wasn't a moment of distraction. The strike that dropped him had been too perfect to leave room for excuses, and acknowledging that required more strength than any training he had ever endured. Around him, the eyes of the entire village followed his every move. And contrary to what he feared, there was no mockery, no snickering, no laughter. There was something far deeper, understanding. Everyone there knew what it meant to face their own pride. Everyone knew the difficulty of admitting a mistake in front of a crowd. And in that moment, the village honored his silence. The impulsive young fighter, the one who had fallen just moments after him, watched with a different intensity. His fall hadn't just exposed his body, it had exposed his temperament. For the first time, he realized that his brute strength was nothing more than a reflection of something he couldn't control. A desperate need to prove something. But prove what? And to whom? He didn't have an answer. As the old man stood motionless at the center of the arena, the impulsive one began remembering every moment he'd lost control, every pointless argument, every training session ruined by ego, every opportunity wasted by impulsiveness. Now, all of it seemed so small, so irrelevant, so avoidable. He closed his eyes and took a trembling breath, letting it leave him with a weight he had never acknowledged before. When he opened his eyes again, there was something different in them. Not fury, but willingness, a willingness to change, a willingness to learn. The third member of the trio, the quiet one, had always followed the others out of habit. He was never the strongest or the fastest, but he watched everything. And what he had seen that day felt like pieces finally falling into place. He had always believed the trio ruled the village because they were stronger. But now he saw that true strength was standing right there, in the old man's calmness, the quiet confidence of someone who didn't need to prove anything to anyone. That realization opened a door inside him, a door that might have been locked for a very long time. The oldest instructor, watching from afar, felt the impact of that moment. He knew how to recognize when a group of young men reached a crucial point, where they either mature or break. And he was witnessing the rare moment in which humility began to defeat pride. The spectators felt it too. The entire village, once accustomed to seeing the trio as dominant figures, now watched their transition into something greater. There was no humiliation. There was growth. There was no defeat. There was learning. And above all, there was a collective sense of hope. The old man finally moved his arm slowly, as if marking the beginning of something new. That simple gesture captured everyone's attention, and a reverent silence swept through the arena. He didn't speak often, but when he did, the entire space shifted. "When the heart learns to listen," he said softly, "the body learns how to win." The words weren't a lecture. They weren't a reprimand. They were an invitation. An invitation for those young men to stop being guided solely by strength and start seeking purpose. To understand that victory isn't about knocking someone down, but about remaining whole while the world tries to shake you. The leader felt those words like a different kind of strike, not to the body, but to the core. He stood up straighter, drew a deep breath, and for the first time since everything began, lifted his gaze with genuine respect. The impulsive one mirrored the gesture, and the silent one did the same. The village watched the birth of something far greater than any fight could reveal. It was the beginning of the transformation of three young men who until now believed that strength was the only path to respect. But now they understood that respect grows from within and only blooms when one recognizes the need to change. The old man saw that realization in their eyes, and he offered only a slight nod, as if saying he was satisfied. Not because he had defeated them, but because he had awakened them. And that afternoon, in that quiet arena bathed in the golden light of a setting sun, everyone felt that something important had begun, not a confrontation, but a journey of overcoming, a journey of growth, a journey no strike could ever stop. The late afternoon breeze shifted slowly, as if even the wind sensed that something monumental was about to unfold. The arena, which moments earlier had echoed with laughter and displays of strength, now felt like an open temple, every movement charged with meaning. Everyone waited in absolute silence for what would come next. The trio of young fighters remained standing, no longer wearing the arrogant posture they had flaunted at the beginning, but instead holding a serious, almost solemn expression. Their transformation was visible, and the entire village could see it. The change didn't come from fear, but from understanding. After all, it's not every day that someone dismantles attacks with such precision and yet shows not a shred of superiority. The old man still stood at the center of the arena, unmoving like an ancient stone, yet radiating life and knowledge. His eyes drifted across each face, as if evaluating far more than muscle or technique, as though he could see straight into the people watching him. It felt as if he already knew exactly what was going to happen, and in a way, everyone felt it too. The oldest instructor stepped forward, unable to hold back his curiosity any longer. He examined the old man's stance carefully. The placement of his feet, the angle of his shoulders, the relaxed positioning of his hands. He knew that the greatest masters of rare styles shared one undeniable trait: the complete absence of tension. The more advanced the practitioner, the lighter the movement, always perched on the edge of perfect fluidity, and this old man was precisely that. While the instructor carried out his silent analysis, the two mysterious men lurking in the shadows grew more and more unsettled. They knew they were looking at someone who could not simply slip off their radar. This elder might be an important piece in something much bigger, something involving ancient techniques, lost disciplines, or perhaps cycles that were coming full circle. The fact that he revealed his mastery publicly was both fascinating and deeply concerning to them. The murmurs among the spectators grew louder. Many tried to guess the old man's origins. A reclusive sage from the mountains, a retired master who had vanished decades ago, a wanderer who preferred anonymity. Each theory felt more impossible and more thrilling than the last. But while everyone guessed wildly, one thing was undeniable. The old man wasn't there by accident. The trio felt it too. They exchanged subtle glances, each processing their own perceptions. The leader, now calmer, seemed to understand that whatever the old man carried within him went beyond combat technique. It was as if the man held an entire history in his breath, experience that no academy or intense training could ever replicate. The impulsive fighter, still emotionally shaken, tried to reorganize his thoughts. He realized now that his strength was nothing without control. The fall, the effortless counter, the old man's gaze, all of it had become a mirror reflecting both his flaws and his potential. The third member, the quiet one, analyzed the old man's movement almost scientifically. He was the most observant of the three and began noticing details that most people missed. The way the elder placed his weight on his heels before subtly shifting it to the balls of his feet, the way his body seemed to adapt to the environment as if he were always several seconds ahead of any action. That was rare, extremely rare. And it was during this moment of deep contemplation that the old man finally took 2 steps forward. A simple gesture, but enough to make the entire arena tremble. He didn't speak. He didn't raise his hands. He didn't assume a fighting stance. He simply walked. Yet the impact of those steps rippled through everyone present. It felt as though his movement announced something imminent, something powerful. The leader sensed it and instinctively adjusted his posture. He didn't know if the old man was about to teach, demonstrate, or reveal the next part of whatever had begun. But he knew he had to be ready. His 2 companions also straightened. Not out of fear, but out of respect. For the first time since the beginning, a true alignment formed between them. 3 young fighters, once driven by pride, now moved by a genuine desire to learn. The entire village leaned forward, waiting for the old man to reveal something. And he did. With his hands behind his back, he drew in a deep breath and spoke a short phrase, one that felt like it opened an invisible door inside every person present. Only those who accept change can truly learn. It wasn't a challenge, it was an invitation. And in that instant, everyone understood that the real demonstration was still to come. The atmosphere tightened, emotions sharpened, eyes focused. The arena was on the verge of witnessing something far greater than clashes or takedowns. It was about to witness the climax of everything that had been building up until now. The air seemed to vibrate as the old man took another step toward the center of the arena. It wasn't just a physical movement. It felt as if he were absorbing everyone's attention and sending it back out in an invisible wave. The spectators froze, their bodies instinctively understanding that this was the most important moment of the day. The silence was so dense that even the faint flutter of the banners above the ring could be heard clearly. The trio of young fighters prepared themselves, instinctively, but not for combat. They weren't bracing to attack, they were bracing to receive. It was the kind of posture that appears when someone realizes they're standing before an opportunity or a revelation. The leader took a deep breath. The impulsive one steadied himself on his heels, and the silent one curled his fists. Not with tension, but with awareness. They weren't looking to prove strength, they wanted to understand it. The old man, for his part, showed no intent to fight, but everyone already knew he didn't need to fight to prove anything remarkable. He simply raised his right hand, palm open, and pointed lightly toward the ground. A gesture so simple, so gentle, that it would have seemed meaningless to anyone who didn't understand. But the instructors understood immediately. The two mysterious men in the shadows understood. Even a few of the more seasoned fighters understood. The old man was calling the three forward. Not to battle, to be tested. The young fighters exchanged glances. No one wanted to take the first step. There was no taunt, no command, no advantage being offered. It was a choice. They had to decide whether they would step forward as fighters or as students. The leader was the first to advance. Slowly, with respect. The ground beneath his feet felt heavier than before. The old man watched him closely. His eyes weren't judging, they were receiving him, inviting the young fighter to reveal who he truly was. And when the leader finally stopped a meter away, the elder did something unexpected. He turned slightly to the side and lifted one arm to chest height, not in a stance of attack, but of balance. The leader understood. The entire village understood. This was the test. The young man raised his arms carefully, the way someone approaches something fragile, and reached out, not with aggression, but with precision. The goal wasn't to strike, it was to connect, but he couldn't. Before he even touched the old man's simple clothing, the elder shifted his weight in a subtle, almost imperceptible way. The movement was so delicate it defied description. And suddenly, the leader felt his own energy slipping into emptiness. The momentum he created turned back against him in the most natural, gentle way. He stepped back to regain balance, but did not fall. The old man simply looked at him, and the young fighter understood. Strength born from pride always finds the void. Strength born from true intention always finds the path. The impulsive one inhaled deeply and stepped forward. He knew he couldn't repeat the same mistake. He understood now that he needed to control himself before he could control the strike. As he approached, the old man leaned slightly to one side, inviting him to try. The young fighter launched a quick movement, not aggressive, but exploratory. The elder slipped away with the grace of someone guided by air alone, shifting only his ankle and a minimal turn of his hips. Then, with a soft touch on the young man's arm, he unraveled the entire structure of the movement. He didn't make him fall. He simply interrupted the force at the exact point where it was born. The impulsive fighter felt something profound, the realization that his own impulsiveness had always sabotaged him. And in that single touch, he understood something he had never learned in training. True strength isn't speed, it's direction. The third fighter approached, the quiet one, the observer. He didn't strike. He didn't test. He simply knelt before the old man, not in submission but in understanding. The crowd didn't expect it, nor did the instructors, nor the two men in the shadows. But the old man smiled. That single gesture said more than 1,000 strikes. It showed someone who understood everything before everyone else, someone who realized the test wasn't physical, it was internal. The elder gently placed a hand on the young man's shoulder and helped him stand. A simple touch of approval, a small gesture, yet powerful enough to make the entire village feel something indescribable. And then the wind cut across the arena. A sudden, forceful gust that lifted dust, banners, even scraps of paper. It felt like an answer from nature itself. The old man turned to the crowd, and for the first time since the beginning, spoke louder. True strength doesn't knock down, it awakens. The words tore through the air like a silent thunderclap. The climax wasn't a strike. It was a collective awakening. And in that moment, everyone knew that nothing, absolutely nothing, would ever be the same again. When the old man's words echoed through the arena, no one moved. It was as if the air had grown heavier, thick with the weight of a simple yet powerful truth. True strength doesn't knock down, it awakens. Those words cut through every person present, not as advice, but as a mirror capable of revealing what each one had always known, yet never admitted. The trio's leader stood in silence, feeling the impact reverberate in his chest. He never imagined that a simple encounter in the arena would alter his perception of himself so deeply. Falling had always been something he avoided, something he feared more than any opponent. But now, standing before the old man, he realized that he hadn't fallen because he was weak. He had fallen so he could grow. The impulsive fighter, meanwhile, battled a storm inside. All his life he did everything too fast, too hard, without thinking, without breathing, without listening to himself. And the old man's touch, that gentle interruption of his momentum, had exposed something he always hid behind: shouting and aggression, a lack of direction. Strangely, for the first time, he didn't feel ashamed of falling. He felt grateful. The quiet one maintained his steady, almost reverent posture. From the beginning, he had been the most observant, and to be seen and approved by the old man felt like the greatest victory possible. Not a victory over someone, but a victory within himself. A form of inner progress he never would have achieved if that unexpected visitor hadn't crossed their path. The spectators stood frozen, absorbing every detail of the moment. Among them were people who would remember that day forever. People who would retell the story at dinners, festivals, gatherings in the plaza, saying, "I was there when the old man dropped 3 young fighters with a single movement." But what he did afterward was even greater. Because in the end, no one would remember just the strike. What would remain was the transformation. The academy's oldest instructor discreetly wiped his eyes, as if touched in a way he never expected. He had taught technique, discipline, strength his whole life, but that day he was the one being taught, by a man no one knew, a master who needed no titles, belts, or trophies to show who he truly was. That gesture, that phrase, that moment left a deep mark on him. Even the children understood something adults spend years trying to learn. Respect isn't born from fear, but from example. And there, before them, stood the greatest example they could ever receive. Someone who won without humiliating, someone who taught without shouting, someone who showed strength without needing to harm. The 2 mysterious men in the shadows exchanged another silent glance. What they saw in the old man confirmed all their suspicions. This man was far more than he appeared. And unlike the village, which now saw him as a sage, they saw him as someone capable of shifting the balance of forces far beyond that small community. They said nothing. They didn't need to. The silent tension between them already warned that this encounter might be only the beginning of something much bigger. When the old man stepped back, seemingly ready to leave the arena, no one dared stop him. There were no more taunts, no laughs, no attempts to assert dominance. There was only respect, pure, deep, genuine. The young fighters opened a path for him as if they were clearing the way for a king. But he didn't walk like a king. He walked the same way he always had, simple, light, discreet. As he passed the trio, the old man only tilted his head slightly, a gesture of acknowledgement, of approval, of closure. The 3 young men accepted that gesture as an invisible medal, not a reward for victory, but a seal of growth. And then, before the entire village, the old man continued down the stone street, disappearing between the old houses and leaving behind a feeling too deep to describe. There was no music, no applause, no celebration, and yet it felt like a grand ending, like the last scene of a film that keeps living inside you long after the screen fades to black. The village would never know his name, but they would never forget his lesson. The arena, once a stage for confrontations, had become the birthplace of a collective awakening, and everyone knew deep down that the day had changed the fate of the community, and above all, the fate of the 3 young fighters who, for the first time, understood the true meaning of the word strength. In the days that followed, the village felt quieter, not out of fear, but out of respect. The old man never returned to the arena, and no one knew where he lived or where he had gone. Yet his presence lingered in every conversation, every training session, every glance exchanged among the three young men who now walked with a different posture, less arrogant, more aware. That unexpected encounter became a local legend, told as the moment when pride fell and wisdom rose. And though the old man had vanished, everyone knew his mark would never fade. If this story touched you in any way, share in the comments what resonated with you most. It helps this video reach more people and strengthens our community. Share it with someone who needs a message of strength and transformation. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell to receive the next stories full of impact, reflection, and insight. Every like, every comment, and every share makes a huge difference in helping this content reach those who need it. Thank you for staying until the end. Your presence means a lot.